positive rebirth, such as a human rebirth. Okay, and then on the other hand, some very negative action coming out of, well, misapprehension of reality and then giving rise to hatred, etc. And then leading to a really negative type of action, very hateful. Could lead an imprint, and a residue. Imprint is just another word for residue, on your mind for a really horrible rebirth. In a state of, for instance, an animal where you have no options, where you have no possibilities. So, where this action takes place, what happens to this action? This is the whole difficulty, really. What happens to this action? In particular, in the context of no self. Right? We talk about there is no self, there is no soul. Of course, there is a conventional self. But the conventional self does not allow for something solid that holds the residue of our actions. It's very difficult, actually. On one hand, we talk about karma and rebirth, and then there's no self. It's like, what? This is why in the non-Buddhist systems that preceded Buddhism, they talked about karma and rebirth, but a self. Right? How can you... and in fact, as we go along, the text here says how the Buddha himself taught. The Buddha himself, he sometimes taught that there was a self. He taught it in particular to those who did not believe their actions had consequences, that there's no rebirth. To those he said, well, but there is, because there's a self. There were those philosophers in India called the Charakas. And the Charakas would say, there's no rebirth, there's no karma, there's nothing there, there's no self, there's nothing. So they had fallen to the extreme of nihilism, there's nothing, we don't really exist, nothing is there. They had a very peculiar way, and not all of them, but some felt, some thought there was just nothing, there was no self, therefore there was nothing to be reborn. So, whereas the other philosopher felt there was Atma, there was a self, they said, no, there's nothing there. And so for them, the Buddha said, oh, there's a self, all right, and that self accumulates karma, and that self is reborn. Okay? Because what is important, and I think it's beautiful that this also reflects our modern situation, without a strong sense of identity, you should not deal with selflessness. Not a good idea. So if you have due to some, I don't know, physical, mental disorder or anxiety, whatever, if there's not a healthy sense of an I, it can be quite dangerous to go into selflessness. Okay, anyway, this we'll deal with later. But the point is that actually in Buddhism there is no such a solid self. There is mental consciousness which is ever-changing. Now, here the 12 links explain exactly this process, how I can do something now and experience the results of that sometime in the future. In particular, with the kind of karma that is responsible for our birth now. I don't know whether you ever ask yourself, why am I born in this state? Why? Why am I this person now? Why not someone else? Why to those parents? Why? I remember when I was very young, I had no spiritual inclination or anything, but I remember at some point when I was like, I don't know, 10 or 11, I started asking this question. Why? Why like this? And it made me always dizzy. So I thought it was really cool. I felt really dizzy. So I would ask this when I feel really dizzy. That was it. I never looked for an answer. I just got myself dizzy. Just stood there thinking, why? Just enjoyed that moment. Bizarre, I don't know. And like I said, I never tried to find an answer. But I remember it was pretty powerful, just thinking, what is all this? Okay. Now, actually, if you look at your own life, you accumulated the cause in the past. You were reborn as a human being. And that was a really powerful positive action. However difficult your life may seem, but it's so much better in comparison to a lot of other lives. Even within the human existence, but human existence in general is considered to be really great, with great opportunities. Okay. Now, but this process, how from the past, how could actually this residue that was left on your mental continuum, how could that give rise to now in this life you being human. And then in terms of your next life, what is that process? What happens? And it's actually really easy. The 12 links are not difficult, but it's a weird way of setting it forth. There's something in between, called name and form, feeling, etc. That is weird. That's the part we struggle with. If that wasn't there, it wouldn't be so difficult. But it's just telling you this. Okay. The fact that I do something in a previous life and I can experience it in this life. That's straightforward. That's not that difficult. So in my last life I did something, let's say I accumulated the cost to be human in the immediately preceding life. Okay. And now, as a result of that karma, amongst many other karmas, but because of a certain karma that's happened to ripen at the last moment of my previous life, I'm born human. That is very easy. But how about I accumulated that karma many, many lifetimes ago, and then it ripened in the immediately preceding life? How's that possible? It's no tangible I, no real I, and I can have this residue that gives rise to this present rebirth. I've had it for millions of years. That's a possibility. Okay? This is true not just for the karma that was responsible for this rebirth, it's called projecting karma, but also for all the experiences we have in our daily life, which are described as completing karmas. It is possible we accumulated them many, many lifetimes ago. So even though we've been practicing well, we've been kind, we've been compassionate, stuff happens. Horrible things could still happen to us. So to be aware that sometimes a negative karma that lay dormant for a long time can now ripen in a certain experience. In a certain experience doesn't mean everything collapses around us. It's an experience. It's the experience we have. I just feel so miserable suddenly. Don't know why. Or because the circumstances, the karma ripens in the form that I have a certain experience, like external situation, and then of course that makes me miserable. It can manifest in different ways. But the point I'm trying to make is that this can happen over many, many lifetimes. Okay? And so therefore, to describe that process, to describe the fact that a karma can be accumulated in one lifetime, then it ripens in the next lifetime, and it is experienced in the third lifetime. Well, to describe that, you have the 12 links. Okay? So, a karma to be reborn in a certain state can only ever be, so I mentioned already, projecting karma and completing karma. Projecting karma means the karma that is responsible for a particular rebirth. Completing karma is the karma that is responsible for all other experiences. Now, with regard to karma that is responsible for a particular rebirth, I cannot accumulate that karma in this lifetime and also experience it in this lifetime. Logically, right? Because it's for a rebirth. So, it can only have been in a previous life and then be experienced in this lifetime. Okay, that's the only possibility. So, it cannot be experienced in the same life, while completing karma can be experienced in the same life. Okay. Now we specifically talk about why we're reborn with this body and this mind. This body and this mind is samsara. There's no world called samsara. This is not samsara. You're not within samsara. You're within samsara. You're in this mind and body, which means you're in samsara. Not because you're in this place. Okay. So we're reborn with this mind, this body, which is our personal samsara. And that's the only samsara there is. But that must have happened in the previous life. Straightforward. Just a previous life, easy. But the 12 links consider another possibility. Not in the previous life, but in a life before that. So you have a life before that. So this is life C. Then you have life B and life A. So during life A, the karma was accumulated. Then during life B, it ripened. And then life C is the result. That's all it explains. A, B, and C. You could explain A and B. It's possible. That's straightforward. But since that's easy to understand, why would you explain it? If you understand this process, A to B to C, you understand A to B. Does that make sense? All right. Now we're looking at 3 lifetimes, A, B, and C. Now, also what's difficult in this process of explaining the 12 links is that you look at different aspects with regard to each life. A, you look at a certain aspect. Life B, you look at it from a certain perspective. What you find in B, you must find in the first life, in life A, and you also find in life C, but you don't mention it. Right? You don't mention it. Just because you're trying to understand one perspective. You look at it from different angles. Does that make sense? So from a different angle, there are certain links of the 12 links. There are certain links associated with life B. There are certain links associated with life A, certain links of the 12 links associated with B, and certain links associated with C. And although these links exist in all 3 lives, you don't mention them because you're just trying to understand one perspective. Am I making sense? No, the example comes now. The example I'll explain now. Alright, so let me just give you a rough version. And before I read this, it's probably easier. So the first 9 verses explaining what I'm going to tell you now, but it's easier if you have just a rough kind of idea. First, there's a misapprehension. Of many, many misapprehension, you zoom in into one perspective, just one misapprehension. Okay. Now, this misapprehension, whatever, with regard to yourself or something else, then gave rise to other misapprehensions, afflictive emotions, or positive emotions, who knows? Never mind, but it's the misapprehension that lies at the root. And that gave rise to volitional actions that are influenced by that misapprehension. Even if it was a positive action, but it's influenced by that misapprehension. This misapprehension, these actions then are either of body, speech, or mind. But the point is they leave some residue, they leave something in the mind. So that is the first link is the misapprehension, second link is the karmic actions, third link is the causal consciousness, as it's called, causal consciousness. You leave something in the mental consciousness the moment it happens, and don't think of them as separate. We say we leave something in the consciousness, as if there was like a separate entity called karma kind of popped into the mind. That's not how it works. It's just for the sake of understanding we use these different terms, but it's really the mind itself has now slightly changed, not obvious to us, but changed in terms of holding the residue of this action. Every time we act, our mind is slightly different than before because it's left something in the mind. And Tsongkhapa, for instance, in his commentary says that it pervades the mind. Every action pervades the mind. As in, like, it's of one nature with the mind. You can't separate it. Okay. Now, that is the causal consciousness. That's one life. That's what we need to know about life number 1. What do we need to know? That misapprehension leads to a certain action that leaves something in the mind. That's all we need to know for life number 1. If we had only 2 lives, it'd be different. But for the sake of just looking at it from that angle, we need to know misapprehension leads to action, leads to something left in the mind. Okay. Now we move to life number 2, life B, which is talking about this causal consciousness now continuing on to another life. But not as a result of this action. We're trying to show that it's possible that this action just lies there, dormant, right? But can be carried on without being destroyed. Okay? So, we show this angle.